I'm Michael Harper. I'm a professor here. I've been a professor here since 1978. And it's great to be back in the auditorium that we used to use a little bit more than we have more recently. I teach employment discrimination law, among other subjects. And I'm not going to be presenting a paper as Professor Collins did. I'm just going to be commenting on our other presenters here at this panel. There are four of them. And I will introduce them together, as have other moderators in the order in which they will speak. That will be first William M. Rodgers. The third is a professor of public policy and chief economist at the Heldrich Center for Workforce Development at Rutgers University. Prior to coming to Rutgers, Professor Rodgers served as chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor. His policy work spans working on acting Governor Cody's pension benefits review task force, and serving as a member of Governor Corzine's Commission on Government Efficiency Reform, and currently sits on the National Urban League's Council of Economic Advisors and served on President Obama's Department of Labor transition team. So he's well qualified to speak on economic trends. We have three law professors in addition to Professor Rodgers. First will be Michael Selmi, who is the Samuel Tyler Research Professor at George Washington University Law School. Professor Selmi writes on employment law and employment discrimination law. He writes extensively. And he is a particular expert in and has been an active participant in debates regarding issues relating to work-family balance and gender equity, and I happen to know he's a very active father in addition to these things. Not to say Professor Rodgers isn't, or I just know that about him. Okay. Professor McGinley is a William S. Boyd Professor of Law at the Boyd School of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she has taught since 1999. Before teaching in UNLV, she taught at Florida State University Law School and also at Brooklyn Law School. She's a nationally recognized scholar in the areas of employment law, employment discrimination law, and disability law. She's published many articles, over 35, and book chapters on employment and anti-discrimination law. She's a co-editor of a book, Masculinities in the Law, that I just saw, a multi-dimensional approach I just saw out on the table. You can buy it. And we're looking forward to her talk as well. And then our last speaker is Professor, let me get the right bio here, Kingsley Browne, who has been on the faculty of Wayne State University Law School since 1989. Before that, he was a partner at Morrison & Foerster in San Francisco. He had a distinguished law school career, after which he clerked for Byron White on the Supreme Court. And his publications have dealt primarily with employment discrimination law in general and with the legal implications of differences between the sexes in particular. So he's going to provide a different perspective here for our panel. So let's begin with Professor Rodgers.
Okay. Good afternoon. Wow. Okay. Good afternoon. Hello. Hello. Out there. All right. So what I want to do in my 12 minutes, and I'm going to try to stick with it, is basically kind of react to sort of the four primary data observations that are used to sort of support what I would call, or in the economics world we would call sort of the end of men hypothesis, but then offer two sort of reactions on some areas of extensions that we need to think about. And then third, right, third, really ask the question of, and give you some of my preliminary thoughts on what does the future have to hold in an economic sense for men and women. And that's really, as I was sort of trying to crunch down my thoughts, my ideas, that's really, I think, what I feel like I can offer in terms of sort of some new thought or something maybe more provocative thought to generate discussion. So I'm going to start there at the end of my talk and then kind of go back to sort of the nuts and bolts in terms of sort of what are my reactions to the data that's been utilized to support the end of men sort of hypothesis, rise of women hypothesis. And then I'll move down, if I have time, or maybe in the Q&A I'll talk about, because I have some very strong feelings about the lunchtime conversation, some of the earlier conversations about African-American men, African-Americans, and that particularly the punchline there is African-Americans and African-American men are the canary in the coal mine, as one of my colleagues likes to say, and that the 1981-82 recession was really the sort of Great Recession for African-Americans and really ushered in the challenges that African-American families faced. For example, real quickly, African-American women, at that time, 45% of them made up the African-American labor force. By the mid-1980s, 4 years after the recession, that had risen to almost 50%. Right? So there's a lot to be learned, I think, about the future going forward in terms of what are these broader reactions or responses to the recent Great Recession and slow recovery. So let me start again at the end of my talk. So what does the future have in store for men and women? Well, the U.S. economy is facing several major challenges, as we all know. The economy and labor market are recovering from the worst recession since World War II. Now, analysts thought that sharp economic downturns were a feature of the past. Right? Recessions were now characterized as having a short and shallow pattern or dynamic. However, instead, we got both. We got the 1981-82 sharp downward turn, but then we've had this excruciatingly slow jobless recovery, and then what I've been calling publicly, and a lot of press I do, is a sort of a pothole recovery, or a bifurcated recovery. That we've had job creation, but it hasn't been large enough to extend or create prosperity. Cyclical. Structurally, the link between productivity growth and wage growth has severed. Labor share has fallen. People talk about that indirectly in their earlier panels. Further, it looks like productivity growth and thus income and wage growth may be slowing. Related, we've seen a new surge in income inequality that it could reemerge actually, either through the continued effects of globalization and IT adoption. Right? Economist Alan Blinder, Princeton economist, he's found that even a large number of service sector jobs, right, are at risk of being outsourced. And I argue that if enacted, the cuts in human priorities that the United Nations calls, so these are investments in education, investments in training, investments in communities, investments in infrastructure, that if those do occur either through the sequestration conversation or through the Ryan-Romney budget, that you will end up seeing potentially the cyclical unemployment that was created during this recession and recovery, the cyclical underemployment, okay? People working part-time at wanting to work full-time. People working in occupations that they weren't trained for, they weren't educated for, that those cyclical underemployed and cyclical unemployed will become a structurally unemployed set of individuals and families. Right? So but now, with that, the question facing researchers and policymakers is not only how to reignite job creation, the machine that we saw in the 1990s that spawned 22 million jobs, but also how to create broad-based prosperity that counters the structural changes that have led to the claims of the end of men. In the context of the end of men hypothesis, the question is how do we narrow the gender gap without further eroding employment and earnings opportunities or the prospects of men? First, I think we have to prevent today's near-record levels of long-term unemployment and underemployment from becoming structural. As of 2011, the shares of men and women that are long-term unemployed, 27 weeks or more, actually are very similar. I was kind of surprised that 44% of unemployed men are long-term unemployed and 43% of unemployed women are long-term unemployed. And it's fascinating is if you look across age, the percentage of the unemployed, yes, their long-term rises, so older people have a larger percentage within their age group who are unemployed or long-term, that percentage rises. The only difference is, except for 65 and over segment of the population of unemployed, men and women have virtually identical percentages. So there's a little bit of a difference for people who are 65 and over. But for the most part, in every single age group, that sort of percentage that I talked about overall is roughly the same. I looked across marital status in terms of the percentages of long-term unemployed. By race, are very similar. Okay? From this evidence, one might conclude that the emergence of structural unemployment may not differ by gender. Right? That they are starting out roughly the same. However, and this is why I guess I was asked to come, be a two-handed economist. However, this will depend on a variety of things. Let's focus on men for a minute. One, men's preferences toward jobs that are viewed as female. We've talked about that a little bit at lunch in some of the earlier conversations. Two, men's investment in soft skills, such as the social intelligence or open communication skills, right, that have been talked about as becoming much more important in the economy. Three, men's relative exposure to unfavorable demand shifts created by or continue to be exerted by globalization and the adoption of technology in the workplace. Fourth, men's preferences towards higher paying, faster growing, and stable trade occupations. Because it's interesting, if you look at the sort of BLS or the Bureau of Statistics projections on employment, what you'll find is, yes, if you look at the largest growth, which I think is what Hannah Rosen looks at and many other people have looked at, yes, those top 15, and I extended it to the top 40, which gets you to like half of the 22 million jobs that are going to be expected to be generated over the next 10 years. Those are low paying, but they also tend to be, they tend not to have male-dominated occupations. In that group. But if you shift to the fastest growing, so that is, but in percentage terms, where are those fastest growing jobs going to occur, right? And why would you want to do that? Well, from an economist standpoint, we can start looking at fastest growing jobs because of the potential growth of skill shortages or labor shortages. What happens there? Well, you get upward pressure on wages. You get employers, right, being less concerned about, in theory, and it's shown empirically, less concerned about, gender and race of the applicants. That we need, productive individuals who are going to fill and be and work in our workplace. Right? So, and if you do that, what you end up seeing is a larger number of occupations that show up on this fastest growing set of occupations are in the trades. Brick mason, carpenter, career technical, other kinds of career technical occupations. And I'm a former school board member of a career technical school in high school. And the reason why I talk about men's preferences toward high-paying, these fastest-growing trades, is that in many well-off communities, and even in middle-income communities, and particularly amongst black and minority families, there is this, the hackles immediately go up, and you start talking about, well, I want to, we suggest that your kid or your child pursue a career technical career. And we even had our teachers who taught IT classes. They refused to label many of their courses as career technical because there was this innate bias that students and parents would have if there was this label, right? How people's preferences towards the trades change will be very important for men. Again, why is this important too? One of the, many people have written and talked about how this recession has caused people to push their reset button, right? To really step back and say, well, what am I really evaluating, and what kind of careers do I want? Well, one of the aspects of the reset button has been pushing and wanting more security. To this day, I'm hard pressed to think about how you could outsource a plumber, right? Or how you could outsource an HVAC technician. That's why I stress this last point about men's preferences towards these trades occupations. Shifting to women, women's labor market choices will have an impact on the extent to which the structural unemployment and underemployment emerges and then differs by gender. Several questions that come to mind here. Will the public sector jobs, over 500,000 that have been lost since February 2010, when the private sector job market began to recover, are those permanent? Are those permanent? And then hence, where will women who've lost those jobs, where will they go? Will younger women want to and be able to move into trade occupations? Right? That if you look at BLS data for many of these trade occupations, you're still looking at 1.5%, 2%, 3% of brick masons, of carpenters are female. Right? So yes, there has been improvement in breaking the glass ceiling in higher educated occupations. However, when you look in that middle, and that's again one reason why I'm focusing on the trade areas, so it's focused on that middle, right? There still is an incredible amount of entry barriers and difficulties in advancing in these trades. Third, will further inroads in child care, and now, and this is from my United Way involvement, we're seeing is elder care. We focus a lot on child care, but elder care with the aging of the baby boomers, that's also going to be a new sort of stressor, and if it isn't a stressor for many already. My parents went through it a couple years ago with my grandmother, and I have several colleagues who have been going through it. So there's the anecdotal, but also it's we're seeing it in some of our initiatives at the United Way that we're focused on. So will further inroads in child care and now in the future elder care be made such that not just women can maintain their labor force attachment and if needed, increase it. In dual-parent households, the emergence of structural unemployment and underemployment will depend on how spouses decide to allocate home production. Men who face difficulty finding employment and those that experience large reemployment wage losses might decide that it's better for them to become or expand their role as primary caregiver. The latter, in terms of wage losses, is really going to be key. Before this recession, sort of the average wage gap or wage loss pre and post sort of layoff and reemployment is about 15 to 20%. And there does seem to be some evidence that has actually gotten bigger post this recession. And so then finally, a gender-neutral factor will be whether individuals and families can easily move to low unemployment, high job growth areas. The housing crisis, as we all know, has restricted the ability of families to relocate to opportunity. So this is, people focus a great deal on mortgage markets, refinancing, but you're already hearing a lot of stories about people commuting, right, large distances, right, or people, one spouse moving several hours away, where they're even flying, and they work in Chicago and they fly home to New Jersey on the weekends, right? So I'll stop there, because that particularly starts to get into, right, the issues around how we allocate time within our family, who's spending more time, who's shuttling the kids from their travel sports, and who's doing the shopping, who's doing the cleaning. So these are just the tip of the iceberg kind of conversations that are all going to be driven by what happens to unemployment and underemployment. Does it stay cyclical, where people will get back in the labor market really quickly, or does it become something structural? And if it becomes something structural for a large number of people in communities, it's going to be a much, much more intractable problem, from a public policy standpoint and from a family standpoint. Thank you.
Well, I want to first echo some of the comments that a particular comment that Joan Williams made at lunch, that like Joan, I don't get out as much as I used to, although I think the reason is quite different. Most of my reason is for the absence of invitations. But it's really nice to be here today, to be invited. It's particularly nice to be back here at BU, where I spent some time, and just to be reminded of what a terrific faculty they have. And Linda's done a wonderful job putting this all together. And this was an opportunity for me to get back to some work that I had done in the past. I haven't really been working in this area for a while, in part because it felt stale to me, and this has been a nice opportunity to do so. And over time, as I worked on this paper, the working titles changed some. Originally, my working title was The End of Men, Really? And then I look at this panel and I think, hey, it doesn't look, not so much. The men are back. We have 4 out of 5 on this panel, so maybe it's actually the reverse. But as I worked on this, the working title is Can All Women Be Pharmacists? Because that seems to me, as I was reading the book, the area that Hannah Rosen emphasizes, and from my delving into the data, the pharmacist, I concede, is an area that women have successfully integrated without deteriorating the wages, but it's hard to find too many other positive stories in this area. I should also note that this, I apologize for not having PowerPoint slides today. I will have the tables in the finished paper, so you have something to look forward to. And this is also a paper that's being co-authored with my research assistant, and I want to make sure I say that because she might actually look at this online. And I also want to say that she has done fabulous work, and I hope she will continue to do so, particularly when exams are on the horizon. Her name is Sonia Weil, which I should mention. And so this paper is a jointly authored paper. And one of the things I thought I would begin with, because it did make me think through some of the issues, is just I'm going to go through my day yesterday before I came here and just give you a sense of the world I encountered. In the morning, I dropped my children off at the bus stop, where there were 3 other children waiting with their mothers, all of whom had advanced degrees, and by that I mean the mothers, not the children. And those mothers would then return home to wait for their children's day to end. My children's bus would take them to their middle school, where together they would spend the day with 14 different teachers, 2 of whom were men, and 1 of those teaches PE. As for myself, I began my drive to my office, where I first pass a fire station. If I were to go inside, I would find all men, and almost certainly all white men. In fact, I could drive through our whole county, which is a big county, and I think there are 30 fire stations, and I would not find a single woman firefighter, even though litigation to integrate fire departments began in the 1970s and continues to this day. As I continue my drive, I go by a library, and when I go inside the library, I see all women, although actually in that library, if I were to look up the director, it would be a man, and that actually turns out to be true for lots of research libraries as well. And as I drive my 5-mile, 3-hour drive into my office, I encounter construction crews nearly every 50 feet. And while moving past them, I look to determine the gender composition, and I see 1 woman in all the groups working in traffic. Although I do notice that they're mostly racially integrated crews, but in terms of women, there's only 1. And that reminds me that we need to have work done in our home. We need to have a plumber. And if I were to call for a plumber, 99% chance it would be a man. And we also need an electrician. The same would likely be true. And just last week, I actually needed to have our car repaired. And if I were to have looked for a woman to do the work on the car, I would have run out of gas long before I found somebody to do that. Once I arrive at my school, if I were summoned to the dean's office, which is thankfully not a frequent occurrence, I would first encounter a whole troop of women outside, as with various titles and the like, but once I got into the inner sanctum of the dean's office, it would be all men, as it's been for many years. I could safely, and then if I needed to complete a men's basketball team, all I'd have to do is walk into any constitutional law course, or just about any constitutional law course, and grab one. But if I needed a woman to fill out a co-ed softball team or baseball team, I'd just have to go into family law or trust and estates, and I would have been able to do the same thing 20 or 30 years ago. Although, I'll leave it at that. And then, before I headed to the airport, I went to my daughter's school for a track meet, where there was lots of activity going on. Boys were playing a baseball game, while girls played softball. In the cross-country race, the boys and girls ran separately, with the men going first. There were also 2 soccer teams playing nearby, very young kids, 5 or 6 it looked like, who were running in circles, as they do at that age, but they were doing it on separate fields, boys and girls, conveying the impression, even when they were doing exactly the same thing, they must do it differently. At the airport, the TSA agents presented me with the first integrated workforce I had seen. 2/3 were men, but the women were seemingly doing the same thing. But on the plane, all of the flight attendants were women, although this is an area where you see men pop up periodically. But then as I was leaving the plane, and the cockpit crew was thanking me for flying, they were all men, and I can only remember one time in all the years that I flew that the voice telling me, "This is your captain speaking," was a woman's. And then as I think back on my teaching when I began 20 years ago, I consider how things have changed. And I wonder if I was driving around with kids at that point, how much would be different? And I realize not so much. I do not, with the possible exception that my children now have a female school principal, and my dean, when I first started teaching at North Carolina, was a woman. But the firefighters, the police officers, the construction workers, the gardeners, housekeepers, plumbers, electricians, teachers, pilots, flight attendants would all pretty much look like they did 20 years ago. No one can deny or should deny that we have made a lot of progress on issues of gender equity over the last 3 decades, and that's the point that was reiterated this morning. But I don't think progress should ever be confused with victory. And when one looks into the workplace or the schools, the strongest vision that remains, at least to me, is one of difference rather than equality. And the same is true when we dissect wages. Women continue to trail men in most fields and in virtually every field over time in that. So I thought what I would do is go through some of the evidence that Hannah Rosa presents for the triumph of women and just suggest that the data may not be as supportive as she suggests. We've already talked about the recession, and it was clear that men fared worse during the recession, but they've also fared much better during the recovery. Most of the gains that women made during the recession have been ameliorated during the recovery. And I think the real question with the changing nature of the economy, and this is the question that I think Hannah Rosen is posing, but I don't know that she answers fully. It's a difficult question, and I do think the book has a lot to recommend it. And I think the arguments in the book are much more nuanced than in the magazine articles, and I think that's just the nature of having more space to do it in that. But the question, I think, is whether this new economy values women's skills more than men's. Now, to state that suggests that there are differences in the skills. It might be possible that women are just doing things better than men in that, but that's not what the data show. The data continue to show that men and women are doing different things, and I'm not even sure what it would mean for the new economy to value women's skills more. One area that Hannah Rosen emphasizes is the rise, the changing nature of occupations, the fastest growing occupations, and as Bill Rodgers just talked about, Bureau of Labor Statistics puts them out, and the top 2 are women-dominated fields. There's no doubt about that. Personal care aides and home health aides, both of which have a median wage of below $20,000, both of which are growing faster than any other by far and have the lowest median wage of any of the top 20 future occupations. The others, where the women dominate, are veterinarian technicians and planners, meeting planners. And it seems to me it's highly unlikely that the path to greater equality is going to be blazed through home health care aides, meeting planners, or veterinarian technicians in that. The jobs, all of those are also jobs that don't require advanced education, so that the educational advantage that women have today may not be so important in the future. One thing that seems clear for the future economy is that it's not necessarily that people have college degrees. What's more important is the skills that come with particular focused education, and that is being done more at community college level than at the college, 4-year college level. One of the areas, so that mentions the education. I thought I would talk about education a bit. We haven't had a lot of focus on that, because Hannah Rosen placed a lot of emphasis on the female dominance within education. But one of the things that's clear is women's college attendance rates first surpassed men's in 1978, about the same time Archie Bunker was calling his son-in-law a meathead in that. They had a higher share of what are defined as first professional degrees as far back as 1983. It's hardly a new trend. The percent of women aged 25 to 29 who had some college was higher than men beginning in 1987 and more bachelor's degrees in 1991. Although for black women and for Hispanic women, they exceeded their male counterparts in the mid-'80s in that. And despite that, those higher attendance rates forever, over basically forever in the last 30 years, women's wages continue to trail men's across the board. And there's the Employment Policy Institute's Working America series has good charts on this, and then you can look at the charts and you'll see that women trail men in every single, when they break the data down, every single wage level, whether at the highest and the lowest quartiles, and at every single level of experience. There's no place that women trump men in those charts in that. One of the reasons for that is women and men continue to study different things in college. And this, somebody mentioned earlier this morning, the trend is actually not positive in most of this area in that. For example, in computer science, women made significant progress in the mid-1980s, where they doubled their number of bachelor's degrees. But that progress was reversed in the 1990s, when the number of bachelor's degrees went from 15,000 administered to women in 1985 to 7,000 in 1996, and remains at 7,000 today, when men earn 4 times as many degrees as women in computer science. Engineering is basically the same, but of course, the opposite pattern is true with the female-dominated areas, psychology, sociology, or education. Education, the numbers of women have been increasing, as is true for teachers, where a few years back, women reached an all-time high as a percentage of teachers in that. And it's hard to find, outside of these pharmacists, it's hard to find a place, an area that women are dominating in that. And you can also see patterns, and we've talked about this, and my time's up, so I'll just mention it's true with lawyers, it's true with doctors. Men and women often do different things, and women are always doing things that are valued less, at least by the market. I know one answer to all of this is, well, things have changed. That the new generation coming up has a different mindset, and they're moving, and they're making different choices. Well, one thing, it seems that if you think of these as just unconstrained choices, it seems that they're choosing inequality. And that doesn't seem to be a choice that we should accept or think of as triumphant in that. But I also think about my own children in terms of their different mindsets. My children have grown up in a family where both parents always worked and where the gender roles are often confused and neglected in that. And one of the things that's interesting to me is when it comes to issues with respect to sexual orientation, gay marriage and like, on that they clearly have a different mindset. Certainly true with race as well. Their views on race really are something that seems to be transformative compared to when I grew up. But when it comes to issues of gender, even though most of our friends, both parents work, it's not true for most of their friends. It's not true for what they see in school. It's not true for what they had when they went to daycare. And when I talk to them and see, it seems to me that when it comes to issues of gender norms, they still seem reinforced throughout, and I think it is much, much too early to declare victory.
Hi. Since I'm from Las Vegas, I always have to do something that has something to do with Las Vegas or something sexy to kind of wake you up in the middle of the afternoon. And of course, I started off with this picture here. I just first of all want to start by thanking especially Linda McLean, but all the folks here at BU who've invited all of us and made such a wonderful time for this. It's been a wonderful, fascinating experience. And I also want to thank Hannah Rosen for being willing to put up with this, because I don't think it's easy to have people talking about your work constantly. So I'm talking about masculinity, labor, and sexual power. And what I want to talk about is use masculinities theory to discuss some of the things that Hannah Rosen talked about. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but then to move to Las Vegas, which is a sexualized industry, and to take a look at whether the same thing is true in sexualized industries, and to talk about how that affects our conclusions. So for just a couple minutes, I'll talk about what masculinities theory is. We've heard a lot from Michael Kimmel this morning, and Joan Williams also was speaking in terms of masculinities theory. It is an outgrowth of feminist theory, which is about 30 to 40 years old, started with sociologists about 30, 40 years ago who were very much feminists, but like Michael Kimmel, felt that men were not under feminism, we're not differentiated enough, that we had to think about, how men fit into it and how masculine norms fit into how things were happening in the workplace. The concept is that gender is socially constructed. It focuses on power differences among men and how that, and the way I look at it is how that affects women. It holds that there's one hegemonic masculinity, the most powerful one, and men are under pressure to prove that particular masculinity. That doesn't mean that there aren't alternative versions of masculinity. There are many, and that's why it's in the plural. But in particular, I want to talk about masculinities theory in workplaces. One of the theories is that men compete to perform their masculinity at work and to prove their masculinity to other men at work. And interestingly enough, men as a group might be powerful, but individual men do not always feel powerful, and that's because of these masculinity norms and prescriptions that they have to abide by. The most important thing for men is to prove that they're not girls or they're not gay. All of us who have sons understand that, and we're always fighting against that. At work is a site for proving masculinity. I think Joan Williams mentioned that. And the two big roles, we've talked about the breadwinner role, but we haven't talked as much about the sexual aggressor role. And Hannah's book talks about illustrates the breadwinner role and how breadwinner, but yet it raises some interesting questions. But before we get there, I want to talk about the study of what I'm going to do. The study of Las Vegas market. I've concluded that although men may be losing labor power because they're hypersexualizing some of the jobs that used to be male jobs, that heterosexual men's sexual desires actually govern the workforce there because it's their view of how women are supposed to be and present themselves that create these jobs for women. So there's this interesting conflict in a sense. So in Hannah's book, she talks about men who lose their jobs. They're more cardboard-like. They don't retrain in the same way. They're not as flexible as women. They don't want to do men's jobs. They want women's jobs. They want men's jobs. And the theory, of course, under masculinities theory would be that that makes sense given the pressure from society for men to feel that they cannot prove their masculinity. It's not a masculine performance if you're working as a nurse or as a teacher. She has one interesting anecdote, well, many, from Alexander City. I really, really thought it was fascinating. A quote where a man said, well, I can't be, this is the South. We can't be teachers. We men are macho. We can't be teachers. We can't be nurses. We're macho. In other words, even though there's this breadwinner concept that being a breadwinner is what makes me a man, it very well might be the type of job. It has to be a man's job in which I'm being a breadwinner. That confers the masculine status. It's not just the fact that the man is earning a good salary. And it may actually, at least in Alexander City, be worse to work in a woman's job than not to work at all. That might be a worse threat to one's masculinity. Now, I don't want to say that this isn't a structural problem. There's a huge structural problem here, but for this, I'm talking about individual men's viewpoints and feelings, and of course, which part of the structural problem, besides the fact that the work doesn't exist in the same way, is that there are churches, and in this particular city, churches and other structures that encourage men not to feel comfortable with their masculinity. In other words, have to prove it in ways that have to do with what type of job they do. Okay, so let's go back to Las Vegas. What we're finding is it's becoming increasingly sexualized in Las Vegas. What's interesting is about 12 or 13 years ago, Las Vegas decided that they were going to market themselves as a family place to go. Well, that totally was a bust. No one came. Well, they came, but they didn't spend any money. They brought their families and they went to see like a few animals. They just weren't spending the kind of money. So they totally, about 10 years ago, just reverse field, and now we have what happens here stays here. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, which of course with the sexual, and of course it was sexualized before, but it's much more sexualized than it was. We've added nightclubs inside casinos. We've added things called pleasure pits, believe it or not, which are actually sort of pits. You go down into them, people gamble, and they have women who are dressed up in very scantily dressed costumes serving the people there. They have added special kinds of ultra bars and ultra lounges, all very hypersexualized, and the purpose being to encourage younger, hipper people to come. Because remember, Las Vegas is the place where my parents used to go, not where my generation or even next generation went. They're trying to get the younger, the Tiger Wood types, and they are coming there. But what's interesting is that men, because of this, are losing traditionally male jobs as bartenders, and at the same, to women, because they're dressing women up in these very hypersexualized costumes as bartenders, and at the same time, they're not entering the traditionally female cocktail server jobs, because I suspect for the same reason that they're not taking the nurse jobs, but even more, because in this sense, the man as sexual aggressor is a concept which men take seriously. And when I say aggressor, I don't mean in a negative way, but then they don't want to be sexual objects. And you see that if you study working class men. I've studied firefighters, and being a sexually competent and a sexual aggressor is an important thing to their sense of self, and they boast about it in the workplace, and that's one of the ways that they prove their masculinity. Okay, so this shows you how what used to be like in Las Vegas in 1957. So the cocktail, in those days, that probably looked a little sexy or racy, but in any event, it's very different from the way it is now. This is the 1990s. We're getting a little sexier, and it becomes even more so today. This isn't a cocktail server, but it's an ad for one of these pool lounges. As you can see, you know, I don't have to mention that. Okay, so I think this picture, whoops, sorry, I'm in the wrong place here. This picture is most common look that you'll see. You notice that they're starting to dress women up in what I would call underwear to work as cocktail servers. And I think, you know, you can understand why men wouldn't want to dress like that, but if you think about it, it is men's heterosexual desires that create this need, and it doesn't go both ways. We don't see men prancing around in little outfits. We see women dressed like this. And even in jobs where you have both men and women, and we're going to see the cocktail server jobs, not cocktail server, the bartender jobs, where sometimes we have women all dressed up in, when the men are in bartender jobs, they're dressed in suits. That's their sexual thing, you know, like they're powerful, but they certainly are not sexual objects. So anyway, in these jobs, I've actually talked to people, and they don't hire males except for in very, very unusual circumstances. There is one casino that does, but I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But, and men don't, you know, I have lots of students, I've been asking them this for 13 years, what do you think about that? Why can't you, I mean, these are good jobs. I'm not just talking about your typical jobs. These are $100,000 a year jobs because they pay them not very much, but the tips are huge. So it makes a difference to families whether men can get these jobs, but they're not going after them. I knew a woman who was the HR director at one of the local casinos, and she said, well, I keep a little skimpy little outfit for men so that I can show it to them if they apply, and that just discourages them all. They won't come. So, and the only place where they are starting to hire men is a place called the Rio, which is the only upscale casino. But they've changed the job of cocktail server to something they call bevertainer. The purpose of it was really to get rid of the older women. And the reason is a bevertainer not only has to serve cocktails, but she or he, but there are very few men, have to get up on a little stage and do a little dance and sing a song. But even interestingly enough, they have highly sexualized the women bevertainers, and the men are in kind of a pajama-like thing. Let's see if I can find them. Let's see, whoops, sorry. So here's the man. His pants are just long black pants, all right? Oh, yeah, but there's a little bit of hair here, so I guess that's sexy, right? I mean, there's almost nothing. The women are in lace teddies. Okay, see, and as far as I'm concerned, I mean, this would be in the Jesperson case, which basically said that you can have different dress codes for men and women under Title VII, unless there's an unequal burden or it's sexualized, sex stereotypes somebody. I think this is a perfect lawsuit waiting to happen. I mean, I can't even imagine that they couldn't, that the plaintiffs couldn't win a case under that. Okay, so, and here are the sexy bartenders, all right? Once again, this used to be a male job, and the men are actually turning around, and actually there is some backlash. There's a lot of blogs being written, there are a lot of articles written by a local reporter about how men are mad because they're not moving into these jobs. And of course, the problem is, there are a number of problems. One is it's good for women, I guess. Well, it's good for individual women who get these jobs. Whether it's empowering for women generally, I'm not sure. But what it doesn't do, I mean, these women, it's a very short period of time when they can have these jobs. By the time they're in their late 20s, they're not going to hire them. So it's kind of like football players, but it isn't as long a period where they can work. And so it can be problematic for women to some extent, but basically they have more labor power. But it's also a problem, it is a problem for men because they're not getting the jobs. But interestingly, the thing that I'm noticing is that when you think about it, the men may be losing the jobs, the positions in the labor market to women, but their heterosexual men have the power as consumers to determine their erotic preferences in these markets. Now, why does it matter about these markets? Well, there are more and more casinos out there, and they're all taking on the Las Vegas kind of idea. I mean, you could have casinos without having, sexy dress, but that doesn't seem to happen anymore. They're more and more sexy, and they're in Dubai, they're in Macau, they're in many, many states now. So this is a major part of our economy. So, coming full circle, it brings us back to Hannah Rosen's position about college students hooking up. I thought it was really interesting what she had to say. That of the empowerment of young women, but I often wonder, and I guess what I'm going to say now has an awful lot, it's similar to what Michael Kimmel said, which is, yes, to some extent, it's better than it used to be, and that's one of the things that Hannah Rosen said. But I wonder about whether it's anywhere where it should be, and I think that's because men are the ones who are determining how things are going to happen. They're the ones who have the orgasms. They're the ones who have their erotic preferences are the ones that seem to be in control, and certainly as far as the relationships or lack thereof, it seems to be men who make that decision. So I'm not really sure. I think before we decide whether there is an end of men, I think we have to look at their sexual power in the labor market and in other markets as well. Thank you.
I'd first like to say thank you to Linda and the other people here at BU for inviting me. I probably get fewer invitations than Michael Selmi does. What I'm going to talk about today is this issue about the tension between claims of the end of men and women's continued inequality. And I'm going to suggest that, at least in some respects, these claims may be somewhat exaggerated, not that there's not good insights there. The paper that I prepared for the talk, the symposium, talks about sex differences, primarily psychological sex differences, also some biological influences on those sex differences, primarily sex hormones. I'm not going to talk about that today, I don't have time. And then the influence of these sex differences on workplace outcomes. And I want to emphasize that the argument isn't that social influences aren't important. Social influences, we've heard about a lot of social influences today, are very important. But to some extent, they're acting on a sexually dimorphic mind. And in a sense, they were actually created by a sexually dimorphic mind. In my paper, I talk about three areas of inequality. One, the glass ceiling. Two, the gender gap in compensation. We've heard some about both of those today. And three, occupational segregation. And Michael Selmi talked a bit about this. But you can see that many jobs remain mostly male or mostly female, preschool, kindergarten teacher, dietitian, receptionist, and so forth. And many remain largely male, primarily, but not exclusively, blue-collar occupations. The areas of primary concern have been two. One is in the STEM fields, the scientific technical fields. The other is in blue-collar occupations. And not surprisingly, there's been less concern lately about blue-collar occupations because they haven't been doing quite so well. They don't, perhaps as Joan Williams was talking, aren't really the path to the middle class anymore. But any explanation or discussion of occupational segregation has to deal with what I call the patchy progress of women. That is, there have been dramatic increases over the last few decades in some occupations and relatively little in others, and the question is why. So here you can see some changes that have occurred over the last 40 years. Michael Selmi mentioned pharmacists. Veterinarians is an even more extreme example. Substantial majorities of new veterinarians and pharmacists are women. Women have, at least in numbers entering the profession, in law and medicine, very high prestige occupations, have approached parity. There's been dramatic change, really, if you think about the proportionate change in other fields such as engineering and physics, but you can see that women still are substantially less well represented, and again, very little change in some blue-collar occupations. So what are the things that influence a particular individual's occupational outcomes? One is physical capacity, the ability simply to perform the job physically. Another is cognitive ability. You have to have the cognitive ability to do a job. The job also has to appeal to your temperament. Not every job is made for every person who has the ability to do it. And this leads to occupational interest, which is sort of a facet of personality. People tend to be drawn to different kinds of occupations. So one question is, are these talents, temperaments, and tastes that people have distributed the same across men and women? If so, then you would expect parity in all these occupations and might suspect, if you don't have parity, that there's something wrong. But I would suggest that to some extent, biologically influenced sex differences play a role in occupational outcomes. And again, the argument is this is not biological determinism. This is the way it has to be. People are just acting according to their hormones, but that these differences do have an effect. Now, physical sex differences are fairly obvious. They continue to be important in a number of blue-collar occupations. There are sex differences in risk preference. Men are much more willing to expose themselves to risk of physical harm than women, and expose themselves to other kinds of risks as well, so that every year it's about 92% of workplace fatalities are men. Somewhat more controversially are cognitive sex differences. There are sex differences in mathematical ability, verbal ability, spatial ability, mechanical ability, some favoring men, some favoring women. And I'm going to focus primarily on the ones that are seen as favoring men, because we're concerned with women's underrepresentation in certain jobs to some extent. Now, the cognitive difference that's gotten the most attention is in mathematics. This is a broad sample of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and you can see that consistently males do slightly better. And it's from year to year, it's true, but the difference between the two is so small that you can't imagine it would have any real-world consequence. In more elite samples, though, you tend to find a bigger difference. So among college-bound people taking the SAT, there's a difference between male and female score on the SAT math of about a third of a standard deviation. There are differences also in spatial ability. And spatial ability isn't typically tested for entrance into academic programs, but it is an important predictor of success in scientific fields, independent of its relationship with mathematical ability. Usually the largest effect is in mental rotation. Here in a meta-analysis found about 2/3 of a standard deviation difference. In mechanical ability, usually the difference turns out to be about 1 standard deviation, such that among the top 10% of mathematical ability, males outnumber females about 8 to 1. Now, more important than mean differences, average differences, are differences in variability. These are all 3 different curves, all having the same mean, but having a different variance. And you can see that this more variable curve, this is just a hypothetical description, this curve here having the greater variance, you see that there's a lot more representation in the tails, both the high tail and the low tail. And it turns out that on a whole host of measures, males are more variable than females. This is a representation of the variance ratios in various countries, OECD countries, in which people take the PISA test. And any variance ratio in excess of 1 means that males are more variable. So in all 41 countries, the OECD countries, males were more variable on the reading, In almost all countries, males were more variable in mathematics. And this difference in variability has an effect out in the tail, as I showed you, of the distribution, so that when you look at the tail end of the SAT math distribution, you see as you go farther and farther out into the tail, the sex ratio increases, the male-female sex ratio increases, so that among those scoring at 800 on the SAT, there are about 2 males for every female. And that's not a great measure of extreme ability because there's a substantial ceiling effect. Lots of people, 11 or 12,000 a year, get perfect scores on the SAT math. There's less of a ceiling effect when 7th graders are given the SAT math. There you see that of those scoring over 700, there's a 2.7 male-female ratio, and of those scoring over 760, there's a 7-to-1 ratio. Now, some people say, well, it doesn't matter because high levels of mathematical ability really aren't important. There's some threshold beyond which more isn't better, that all you need is some amount that isn't all that much. And that turns out not to be true. This is a study of people who were identified as being in the top 1% of mathematical ability when they were 13, and then the study looked at them 25 or more years later to see what their outcomes were. And so this is a comparison of the people in the top quarter of the top 1% of mathematical ability with those in the bottom quarter of the top 1% of mathematical ability. And people in the top quarter of the top 1% were 2.7 times as likely to have any doctorate as people who were in the bottom quarter of the top 1%. Any doctorate here includes things like JDs and MDs. More striking, those in the top quarter of the top 1% were 18 times as likely to have a doctorate in a STEM field as those who were in the bottom quarter of the top 1%. And 7.7 times more likely to have tenure in a STEM field at a top 50 university. So more does seem to be better, but it's important to note that it's not everything. High mathematical ability by itself doesn't really strongly predict hard sciences. The question is, what's the pattern of an individual's abilities? This non-intuitive graph here represents that some people have, some high math people have high mathematical ability relative to their verbal ability. Some people with high math ability have actually low math ability relative to their verbal ability. These people are very high verbal. So people with high relative quantitative ability, that is said to have a quantitative tilt, tend toward the STEM professions, especially if they have high spatial ability. People with a verbal tilt tend more toward humanities and other kinds of high verbal disciplines. And it turns out that high math women actually have higher verbal ability than high math men. So one thing that means is that high math women are more likely to move into high verbal fields than high math men are, simply because they have more options. That is, it's an option that may not be as open to males. And just a quick word about occupational interests. This is the Holland hexagon of interests, of occupational interests. I won't describe it fully, but all I want to point out is there's this dimension here, the people things dimension, which is anchored on one end by the realistic theme. These are people who like to work with their hands, like to fix things and so forth. And you can see there's a big sex difference here favoring males of over 1 standard deviation. On the other end is the social theme. Again, there's a strong difference here favoring women of about 2/3 of a standard deviation. There's this people things dimension is a robust finding in the occupational literature. A recent meta-analysis found that despite all the changes in the workplace over the last several decades in terms of what jobs people are doing, particularly women, that the sex differences are remarkably consistent over time. So this is something that hasn't changed very much over the last few years. So just real quickly, these are some stereotypically female positions. You see that they have a lot of S here, a little bit less here, S on nurse anesthetist, where you have actually a fair number of men in a fairly highly technical nursing field. And here, these blue-collar occupations are heavily realistic and very few women. And you see some of the same thing. This has been mentioned already. Lots of women in science, this includes social sciences, lots of women in psychology, sociology, biology, more people-oriented kinds of fields, substantially fewer in computer science, engineering, physics. Among medical residents, you see the same thing. Lots and lots of women in OB-GYN, in pediatrics, psychiatry, family medicine, relatively few in radiology and surgical subspecialties, which are more thing-oriented. There are other reasons as well for these distributions, but this is one effect. So in sum, I'd say there's abundant evidence that sex differences in talents and tastes actually affect occupational outcomes. It doesn't mean that they're the only things that affect occupational outcomes, but the fact that the sexes gravitate toward different jobs is not by itself, I think, a reflection of inequality, so that despite predictions of the end of men, men will probably continue to dominate in many arenas, just as women will dominate in others based on their talents and tastes. Thank you.
Well, I'm not a social scientist, and thus really do not feel confident to evaluate the methodologies underlying the studies cited by Professor Browne or the statistics relied upon by Professors Rodgers and Selmi. And I also really don't fashion myself a public intellectual, so I'm going to resist expressing my personal views on sociological or economic trends. What I do feel competent and I guess worthy of doing is considering the possible relevance of the materials in these talks to American law. Specifically American discrimination law, which, as I said, I've taught, and which I think is certainly one of the most relevant things, areas of law to a discussion of the comparative position of men and women in employment. Studies like you've heard about today, including on these panels, present what are termed legislative facts, in contrast to adjudicatory facts. These are facts for purposes of the analysis of the process of governmental decision-making. Legislative facts may be relevant to the setting of general legal policies, whether through legislation or through legislative-type regulations developed by executive bureaus or agencies. Unlike adjudicatory facts, however, they do not determine how those general legal policies are to be applied to particular cases. I didn't hear anything in any of the presentations that led me to question the basic prohibition of sex-based employment discrimination in federal Title VII law or the cognate state laws, nor did I hear anything else questioning that prohibition, accepting all that Professor Browne asserts. His cited studies indicate about the different talents, tastes, and interests of the sexes does not lead one, and I don't think it leads Professor Browne, to question Title VII's prohibition of discrimination against individuals who have talents and interests that are not average for their sex and have not been treated as individuals, but rather unfairly on the basis of a stereotype that may have some basis in reality. We're all comfortable, I think, with sex being one of the Title VII protected categories because we all know about the continued existence of the discrimination in the economy referenced by Professors McGinley and Selmi and acknowledged by Professor Browne. Thus, I think it may be better for me to direct my remarks to whether there is any possible relevance of the kind of general studies and statistics provided Professor Browne and others to adjudications under employment discrimination law. I think the answer is clearly not for cases brought by individuals claiming that an employer took into account that individual's sex in making a personnel decision, the talents or success or interests of the average member of that individual's sex in the workforce generally, or even in that job category or category of jobs, is totally irrelevant to the existence of the employer's intentional discrimination in a particular case. Even with something with broad, long tails like theoretical physics, physicists, there can be outliers like the great Lisa Randall of the Harvard Physics Department, the string theorist. And we have to treat, under the law, individuals as individuals. Title VII, as many of you know, however, recognizes causes of action to which studies demonstrating sex-based variations in talents and interests and other legislative facts about the labor market might be relevant. The reason is that these other causes of action are based, at least in part, on statistical proof of either the likelihood of the employer engaging in a pattern or practice of intentional discrimination in the case of systemic disparate treatment litigation, or the employer using employment practice that without strong business justification has the effect of impeding the success of a protected group. Either form of statistical proof requires the definition of a relevant labor market to analyze the likelihood that the composition of hiring or promotion reflects discriminatory intent on the or effects of an unjustified employment practice. And, it's obvious, I think, from the implication of what Professor Browne said, that the varying interests or talents of sexes, especially as defined through educational degrees, should be relevant to defining that relevant labor market. An employer's disproportionate number of electrical engineers, one of his examples, can be explained by the relevant number of men and women with engineering degrees qualified for such positions. And the fire department's disproportionate number of male firefighters might be explained in part by the relative number of men and women interested in taking the risks and bearing the physical demands of the positions. However, while these general studies may be relevant to cases built on statistical analysis, they clearly don't necessarily decide the cases. An employer may have a pattern or practice of discrimination against female engineers, in part because he is burdened by a stereotype of women not having the talents or interests to be successful engineers, based in part on statistics, whether sociologically or biologically caused, and therefore based in part in fact. But still, such a stereotype could cause the employer to discriminate in choosing even from a relevant labor market, more precisely defined to account for qualification and interest. Similarly, that fire department could unnecessarily eliminate from consideration women who want to be firefighters by imposing physical tests that disproportionately affect even that female subclass who is interested in being firefighters. Okay, so I'm sure we can all agree the relative interests and abilities of the sexes, whatever their origin, for some jobs, whether it be of a high risk or high nurturing or high physical or high cooperative nature, is irrelevant for other jobs. The lesson we should remember is that general labor market statistics cannot control specific cases involving a particular employer's choice of workers for particular jobs. Having said this, I would like to discuss briefly the Las Vegas cocktail servers and bartenders case mentioned by Professor McGinley, because I think the case does demonstrate how employment discrimination law cannot be reduced to or controlled by generalizations about what studies show about the relative abilities, interests, or market position of men and women. We don't need any study to establish that females are much better at selling sex, sexual lure, sexual ambience to heterosexual men than are males. And indeed, one might wonder why an employer cannot assert the bona fide occupational qualification defense in Title VII in any case in which an employer is selling sexual flirtation or scenery or allure or ambience, whatever you want to call it, along with some other products such as alcohol. Certainly, Title VII does not prescribe the selling of sex, and unlike the antitrust laws, does not seem to regulate an enterprise tying the sale of products together. Title VII decisions, however, have required employers to use what I call sex as a BFOQ only when the qualification is for the essence or central mission of the particular job. This has been the case particularly for employers attempting to sell sexual flirtation or ambiance along with another product such as attendant service in airline cabins. The BFOQ has been narrowly confined to ensure that the sexualization of the American workforce be kept at a minimum, be kept in bounds, to ensure that the natural biological role of women as the sexual objects of powerful heterosexual men, you want to call them that, not become unnecessarily pervasive in an economic sphere where the objectification of women has impeded the advancement of women in many jobs. So this suggests, real quickly, I want to say this suggests to me a distinction between the cocktail servers and bartenders described by Professor McGinley. The primary role of the former, I take it from her description, is to induce the sale of drinks to heterosexual males. Serving the drinks is secondary. It's induced the sale of those drinks. To prohibit this primary role, to me, is to prohibit the sale of sexual flirtation. The bartenders, on the other hand, utilize a skill to perform an independent central function of mixing drinks. Sexualizing that function, as the casinos seem to be doing now, presumably makes economic sense. I'm sure they wouldn't be doing if it didn't for the rational managers of the casinos. But it nonetheless seems to be in tension with the central purpose of Title VII, the reduction of unnecessary sex-based employment decision-making, supportive of sexual stereotyping and role socialization. I think the law here, as it has developed, reasonably balances not prohibiting the sale of sex on the one hand, but prohibiting the sexualization of independent roles to an unnecessary extent on the other hand. The balance could be set differently, allowing casinos to sexualize any role, even one as secondary as cocktail service, could be treated as unnecessary and as confirming the economic power of heterosexual males, but I don't think that economic power should determine the balance. I presume that to the extent heterosexual women use their economic power to purchase sex or sexual ambience, rational casino managers can respond and will respond to that emerging power by packaging eventually male sexual allure. If they pay enough, they'll find men to take the job, even in skimpy bikinis, I think. Okay. All right. So that's my, I guess we're going to have a little bit of time and sit up at the panel and take questions.
So I know everyone wants to talk about casinos and sex differences and everything, but I want to ask Professor Rodgers to tell us more about your reactions to the invocation of the Moynihan Report and analogies between conditions of African-American men and white men and so forth and so on. You said you had some strong views about some of the things we talked about earlier in the day, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about it.
Sure. Before I talk specifically about race, let me react to one thing that you said, Michael, that I think I'm going to add into my paper with regards to discrimination. And it hit me as I was sitting listening. I mean, the Department of Labor and the administration have put together an initiative that is seeking to minimize discrimination that unemployed, particularly the long-term unemployed, face. And in as much as employers, right, are evaluating whether or not they hire a male or a female who's been long-term unemployed, you can easily begin to sort of generate some dynamics as to how, right, men may favor men over women. And again, I think what we learned too, it really also depends upon the occupation.
Yeah, that also has an age discrimination component to it as
exactly.
well.
Yeah. And then the second sort of message that I would want to sort of leave with you is, so much of this conversation centers around the tails in terms of sort of the extremes, right? Those occupations that are largely male-dominated oriented or largely female-dominated oriented, but that's all well and good. But I think at a little bit it paralyzes us to kind of think about one of the big issues. As I was again preparing for this conversation, I'm kind of like Michael. I've sort of started out here, come back, you sort of return to these various issues, and the issue here is convergence. That if you look at wages, if you look at employment, right, that the convergence, there was a rapid convergence in the 1980s, and then it slowed down in the 1990s, and then even in sort of the last decade or so, there's also appears to be some further slowdown. And so another way of sort of thinking about the question I posed to you in the context of structural unemployment creating more structural unemployment from cyclical unemployment is all. Another way to think about it is kind of what's going to be that next. What's got to happen in order for continued narrowing to occur in the pay gap, continuing narrowing to occur in employment differences, and so that's what I gave you as an initial sort of laundry list with regards to job search, and particularly for the long-term unemployed, and so that's so convergence is really on my mind when I look to revise my work. I'm really going to focus on, what's out there that can explain this. And there's a great study, and I don't know if it's reached this group, but it's by Francine Blau and Larry Kahn, where they try to basically, they don't mention because they wrote their piece before the Rosen work, but they use what they call a wage decomposition approach, where they try to disentangle the various components of change. And unfortunately, they don't have measures of sort of the different kinds of skills that our panelists have talked about that differ between men and women, but they are able to sort of isolate and suggest that, again, there's been rapid convergence between male and female earnings during the 1980s and 1990s, but it's slowed down. Why is it slowed down? Well, one reason they argue or they find evidence is that, the sort of pace of change with regards to the decline of unionization, the pace of change with regards to the sort of shifting out of manufacturing into services has slowed. But they also do seem to find evidence, indirect evidence, for support that there has been there are differences that the skills in terms of how they're rewarded differ by gender, and that explain a large part of the narrowing of the gap. That those skills in terms of soft skills, indirectly begin to be paid relatively more, and that women were in that advantaged women through the 1980s. But again, it's slowed down. The pace at which that contributed slowed down, and I think we need to look at what happened in the 1990s into the 2000s, and also most recently the recession. Now, with regards to one of my colleagues talks about the African Americans and African American men being the canary in the coal mine. That when I read the Rosen book and the articles that support it, one of the things that jumped out at me is that 1981-82 recession was the Great Recession for African Americans, right? And that really, in that recession, just led to black men's unemployment rates skyrocketing to over 20%, while white unemployment rate only rose 9%. But it also ushered in the increase, the further surge of women in the labor force. That going into the statistic that Rosen talks about in terms of the share of women in the workplace, it hit 50% just this past year. Going into that recession, African American women were about 44% of their labor force, of the African American labor force. And because of the depression-like experience for African Americans in their communities, deindustrialization, again, the recession, that led to a surge in the percentage of black women who were in the labor force. I think that by the mid-1980s, black women hit 50%. And today it's about 53%, 54%. So I think, one, canary in the coal mine, but I think going forward, that experience can be utilized to help project what's going to happen after this recent experience. And so I had a piece that looked at young African-American men when they went into labor force in the early 1980s. It took them close to a decade to catch up to their white counterparts in terms of earnings and employment, or at least make up that lost ground. So again, that's sort of, if you understand why the motivation for thinking about long-term unemployment, shifting from cyclical to structural, that's largely part of it. That people talk about a lost decade, that could happen.
Do any of the other panelists have anything they want to say before we ask for other questions? Yes.
I'd just like to say that I don't know if Mike expects this, but I basically agree with everything Mike said about my presentation.
I did expect it.
You did. But the only thing that I might want to know more about is the question of what exactly it is these bartenders do in these casinos, and why it is.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I was just curious what it is that the bartenders do. I've been to bars and the people pour drinks, but there must be something more to what these bartenders do to make the employer want to do this with.
Well, the reason they want to, why do they want to do the jobs? Or what do they do?
No, but what is it that the bartenders do? Do they just prepare drinks for the cocktail servers?
Okay, so it depends on where you are in the casino. If you're on the casino floor, where they would be just at a bar that's on the floor, and then they would be giving them to cocktail servers who would be going and giving to people who are sitting at the tables. But a lot of these hyper sexy bartender women are being hired in what we call the pleasure pits, which are like the 2 steps down, or the ultra lounges or the clubs, they're what is it they're doing? They're being bartenders, though. I mean, they actually do have to tend bar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Let's see, I think I saw this hand right over there first.
Microphone.
She's got the mic.
You.
There's a mic behind you.
Thank you for a great panel. I just have a question for Professor McGinley. What do you think the impact of the pornography industry and the fact that Nevada is the only state in the country that
I
legalizes
can't
prostitution?
hear you. I can't understand you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe without the mic? I'll hold it fast.
Sorry. What do you think the impact of the porn industry is on? It's one of the largest industries on what you're seeing, and also the fact that Nevada is the only state in the union where the sale of women is legal in brothals.
How does that affect
Do you
things in the
think it affects in
casinos?
any way, or-
Should repeat the question. I'm not
So
sure
the
everyone
question
heard.
is, what is the effect of the fact that that there's a very large porn industry, and there's also legal prostitution in Nevada? Now, it's not legal in Clark County, where Las Vegas is, although it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Well, it's a very libertarian state, so that does affect how people think about, sex for sale as something that people make money off all the time. The thing that I think is sort of interesting, and of course, I just think it's just, we're just selling women. We're not selling sex. We're selling a certain type of female heterosexual sex. And I do think the fact that people will, it's like your sisters and your daughters and your mothers work as cocktail servers. I mean, I have lots of students who are have been cocktail servers, or even some of them have been strippers, although they won't usually tell you that unless they come to your office, okay? But generally, there are students who are involved in the industry, but that they see that as part-time, and then they move on to becoming lawyers.
Ms. Ferrari.
Okay, this is a question for Professor Browne. I first want to say I appreciate Professor Harper's comment that a statistical display of sex difference in terms of taste and talent shouldn't determine how we approach discrimination cases. But my question is about what I think is like a dangerous use of the term biological difference. And I was wondering if you could qualify using the term biological difference, because I don't know how the data actually could show a biological difference as opposed to a difference because of sociological norms or perpetuation of gender roles.
Well, I hope I understood your question. The question, as I understood it, one was, do I see a danger in using this kind of information in discrimination cases? And two is should we be careful about calling these differences biological? I would call them, if I'm being careful, more biologically influenced than biological. But I think there's very strong evidence that that's the case. The hormonal data that I talk about in my paper gives some clue to that. And the reason that I think that it's important, for legal purposes, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, whether these if the question is, did an employer discriminate? And if you take these differences as given and you're agnostic about where they came from, I think that's fine. Because I don't think that it matters when examining the employer's conduct whether women don't go into this field because they don't like it, because they were taught as little girls that they shouldn't be interested in this field, or because they've been influenced by hormones over the course of their both fetal and later development. But I think that it is important when we're talking generally about public policy. Because too many people, I think, I'm sure you've heard this kind of statement, well, women are X% of the labor force, but they're only Y% of whatever, whether it's stated or not, usually the implication is X and Y should be the same. And if they're not, we're doing something wrong. We're doing something wrong with the schools. We're doing something wrong with society, because what we really ought to get if society weren't falling down is 50% across the board. So I think that recognizing that there are biologically influenced differences are relevant to that part of it, right? To how suspicious should we be as a society, not about an employer in a particular decision, but as a society when everything's not 50-50. And I just don't think that you can, and my belief is, it's obviously a difficult empirical test, but you can give males and females identical rearing, and you're going to end up with many of these same sex differences, so that it's not just a question of re-indoctrinating society into thinking that males and females basically have all of the same sort of temperaments.
Can we get someone else in here? Is that okay? Because we're out of time. Do we have time for one more question?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that. I thought the panel was great. I really enjoyed it. On Mike Selmi, you were talking about the gender segregation. We experienced that, and this is one way this is enforced. In Palo Alto, as in many areas around the country, there is a parents' club, but it's actually called a mother's club. And that is rigidly enforced. And I know because I tried to apply to that and was rejected. But my wife, who had never applied, was then made a member, right? And I could be an associate member on her membership. And this happens throughout the nation, right? And this is a simple way. We also tried, when we had our first child, we thought we would rear him, without regard to sex roles. But before we left the hospital, we realized that was not true. Because the family not possible, because the family next to us had a little girl, and she had on a nice, the hospital folks put a nice pink cap on her head, and it was tied with a nice ribbon, and it all looked very pretty. And then when they brought our son into us, he had on a blue cap that had been hurriedly cut at a slant, and it was raggedy, and strings were hanging from it.
And a football under his arm.
And they didn't have a ribbon, so they just put a rubber band around the top, and sent us home.
You should have asked for a hoodie.
So that's when the socialization starts. So my question now is, so I got two questions, quick ones. On the bartenders, why was there a flip from men to women, right? Did the patronage of the bars change? What caused that? And then second, let me just throw it out there so I can then shut up after this. On the women who are high math also being high verbal, how do we know that's true? That women who are high in math are more likely to be high verbal than men who are high in math. Is that because we have good estimates of individuals, or is that because there's a gap on the verbal side of the SAT, say, that favors women more than the gap on the math side favors men?
Okay, I'll answer that after Ann goes first.
Yeah, why did it become that they started hiring women to be bartenders? Basically to sex up the place even more. Okay, so somehow, I guess the concept is that they're getting more money from heterosexual men, I suppose, and they're the ones who are going to want to see women that way. And also there were these openings of these new spaces within the casino. So the spaces that were considered more sexualized were ones where they would, for instance, the nightclubs, they would hire women. Now they don't always hire women exclusively in those jobs.
But Vegas has long been sexualized.
Yeah, but I have to tell you, there's been a big change since we've been there 13 years, and I can't tell you how different it is now than it was when the day I walked in the door. Now, I thought it was crazy then, but now it's out of control. It really is. And what they're trying to do is get the young, and they're coming, the Paris Hiltons and all those people are starting to come and hang out at the clubs, and Tiger Woods and all the kind of, especially when the recession was hitting, they wanted people who could come in from California rather than have to fly in. And that's who they were getting into those.
How did the adoption occur? Was it pretty much very widespread immediately, or did you have a kind of a leader and then a leader casino and then a follower?
They didn't, I don't know how it happened exactly. They just started about 10 years ago to open these nightclubs. I think that's where it started. Nightclubs that are within the casinos, and what the casinos then did was they lease them out to management companies. So then the management companies do the hiring so that they're kind of protected from what they're doing. Also, there's allegedly a lot of drugs and stuff going on in these clubs, so that the casinos have been trying to, it's kind of protect themselves from liability. And there's a particular management company called the Light Group that leases out a number of these and is the management company. And they do things like when they hire people, they make them, they come in and they interview in the costume, which is, underwear basically, and that kind of thing.
I just want to put a quick plug for, there's an interesting paper on this by Marion Crane and Diane Avery. 'Cause
Yeah.
I think part of the inquiry is, so why did it take them so long, to bring women in, right? But there used to be prohibitions on women being bartenders, state law prohibitions on women being bartenders. It was dangerous, it was inappropriate, that kind of thing. And I think once it opened up, then you saw a real rapid change.
Well, and actually, there's a whole Duke Law School, Duke Law and Gender Review on. It's not on Las Vegas, but it's on this Jesperson case. And I have an article in there called "Babes and Beefcake" too, which addresses the BFOQ question.
If I could answer Rick's question real quickly, the way that they know that high math women are more likely to have high verbal ability than high math men is because they've actually measured it within people with high math ability. That is, they've looked at mathematically precocious children starting from age 13 and then followed them, and it just turns out that males and females have a somewhat different. I mean, you can I don't want to exaggerate it, but there is this tendency for the high math women to have higher verbal ability, and they also high math women also have broader interests as well. High math men are overwhelmingly interested in math and science. High math women have broader interests in math, science, and humanities and so forth. And so those interests as well are likely to push them in that kind of direction. Or I don't want to say push, influence them to go.
Hannah Rosen, I think it's the last question we have time
Yes,
for.
I have a question for Mike Selmi. I've been thinking a lot about this job segregation question, which comes up a lot when I'm talking about the book. So you used the very memorable phrase, women are choosing inequality, which
If they're choosing.
If they're choosing, but that sticks with me. That's a good way to put it. And I'm thinking about Claudia Golden's study about, for example, why certain medical women move into certain medical professions. And it's interesting because they tend to choose, it seems that what women are choosing is flexibility and a certain limited hours, which we could term kind of, lower pay. Like why women choose teachers not because it's devalued or they're choosing inequality, but because they can be home to take care of their children. And the same is true when she analyzes which medical professions they choose. They almost always align with technological advances which give you control over your time. So, if it used to be you could called up at any hour, now if there's some kind of, PSA test or some test which you can schedule, then women tend to flock to that medical profession. So I guess I'm not disagreeing, I'm just wondering about the framework of it. Like, it seems to me an old way to look at it to say women are choosing inequality or choosing lower paid profession, whereas you could think of it as actually an intelligent choice, like a choice of either a job that's growing in this economy for better or worse, or a job that allows you to have a reasonable existence. So I'm just putting that out there to see your response.
And it's a complicated question, and I think the notion that women are choosing flexibility and stuff feels right, but the data are not really supportive of that. Now, I haven't seen the recent data, but there was a very good study done a while back by economists at North Carolina State, and he looked at the hours women were working, the jobs they were choosing. They were not choosing to work less or to work easier or to be more accommodating. They want that, but there's not that many jobs out there that are as flexible. Firefighting is one of the most flexible jobs there is. They work 48 hours and then they don't work for 3 weeks sometimes and the like.
Extreme firefighting. Is it a class difference where women who do have choices choose flexibility, but if you don't have choices, you don't have choices? Or is it,
I don't think that you could, based on the data that exists, you can say that women are choosing flexibility over income.
I have a son who just went to medical school, and he told me about how, people are choosing. I don't think there's any question that women are choosing, dermatology and it's the surgery, it's a macho thing also.
Right.
So the masculinity theory fits into that. I think it's clearly when they do have a choice, they're choosing based on what you said. I think we're out of time, though. I think we got to move on.